It started as whispers. At first, nobody noticed when one or two people disappeared. After all, this was a small town. People left all the time, looking for better opportunities. But when the numbers increased, when the faces of the missing people became too many to ignore, the whispers turned into fear. Hello, family. Welcome to Storytime Virtually. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel, like and share this video to your friends and loved ones, and don't forget to turn on post notifications for more videos. Sit back, relax as we dive into the story. Mothers held their children closer. Market women stopped staying out late. Young men, who once walked freely at night, now moved in groups. The town of Igbadan was no longer the peaceful place it used to be. The strangest part? The people who went missing all had something in common. They were poor. They had no family. And they all attended Pastor Ezekiel's church. Pastor Ezekiel was once a nobody. Years ago, he was just a struggling preacher with a tiny church that barely had 10 members. He wore the same old suit every Sunday, his shoes had holes, and his wife was always complaining about hunger. His church, Divine Grace Ministries, had nothing divine about it. The roof leaked when it rained, and the wooden benches creaked under the weight of the few people who still attended. But then, something changed. One day, Pastor Ezekiel stood before his congregation and declared, "God has answered my prayers. This church will never lack again." And just like that, money began to flow. The once broken-down church transformed into a grand building with air conditioning and golden chairs. The poor pastor, who once borrowed money for food, was now wearing expensive suits, driving a flashy car, and buying properties in and outside the town.
People were shocked.
How did a man who was struggling for years suddenly become rich overnight? At first, the town celebrated him. They called it a miracle. "God has blessed our pastor," they said. But as time passed, doubts began to creep in. It wasn't just the money that made people suspicious. It was the way he spent it. Pastor Ezekiel was not like other rich men who helped the poor. No, he spent his money on young women, throwing lavish parties in secret. He was always surrounded by a new set of beautiful ladies. Some members of the town began to whisper, "How did he get rich so fast? He was suffering before. And why does he spend more money on women than on the church?" Nobody had answers. But soon, the missing people would provide one. At first, the town did not connect the missing people to the church. It was easy to overlook them because they were people who had no family. A beggar who used to sit by the roadside?
Gone.
A poor widow who lived at the edge of town? Missing. An orphan boy who always came to church alone? Never seen again. The town murmured, but nobody did anything. Then one Sunday, everything became clear. Pastor Ezekiel stood on the pulpit, holding the microphone, and smiled. "If you are here and you have no family, no one to care for you, please stand. The church wants to help." Slowly, people stood up. Some had lost their parents. Some had been abandoned by their relatives. Others were simply alone in the world. The pastor nodded. "We will not let you suffer. From today, we will take care of you." The congregation clapped. The people standing looked relieved. They thought their suffering was over. But in reality, they had just signed their death sentence. This was how the pastor selected his next victim. He acted like he wanted to help, offering shelter and food. But one by one, these people disappeared. It went on for 2 years. And then, one day, the whispers became too loud to ignore. Obo Alade, the town's chief, had heard the rumors. But he never took them seriously until he looked at the list of missing people. His heart pounded. Every single person on the list had been a member of Divine Grace Ministries. Coincidence? He didn't think so. The chief knew he needed help. But not just from anybody. He needed someone who could investigate, someone who was sharp and fearless. And there was only one person who fit that description. Her name was Tenny. A 23-year-old detective, Tenny had built a reputation for solving difficult cases. She was young, but she was brilliant. Nothing escaped her sharp eyes. The chief sent for her immediately. When Tenny arrived, he wasted no time. "I need you to find out who is behind these disappearances," he said. "Our town is no longer safe." Tenny leaned back in her chair, thinking. She had already heard rumors about Pastor Ezekiel. "If I do this, You must promise me one thing, she said. Fix the community pump and renovate the public school. The chief nodded. If you solve this case, I will do it. Tenny smiled. Then let's catch a killer. Tenny spent the next few days studying the missing people. She visited their homes, spoke to the few people who knew them, and followed their last known movements. Every single person had disappeared after attending Pastor Ezekiel's church. Tenny's stomach turned. This is not a coincidence, she muttered. She needed a way to catch the pastor in the act. But how? Then an idea hit her. She needed bait. Someone who could go undercover, pretend to be poor and alone, and walk straight into the pastor's trap. And she knew exactly who to call. Tenny tapped her fingers on the wooden table, deep in thought. She had gathered enough evidence to suspect Pastor Ezekiel, but she needed proof, solid proof that would expose him for who he really was. The best way to do that? Set a trap. But she couldn't do it alone. She needed someone to go undercover, someone who could pretend to be poor, helpless, and desperate enough for the pastor to target. Her mind immediately went to Kola. Kola had been trying to win Tenny's heart for months. He was a smart, confident young man, and while Tenny liked him, she had been too focused on her work to give him a chance. Now, she had the perfect test for him. That evening, she called Kola and asked to meet at a small restaurant in town. When he arrived, he was grinning. Tenny, is this finally a date? He teased. Tenny rolled her eyes. Kola, I need your help. His smile faded. What is it? She leaned forward. I know you like me, and I know you want me to give you a chance. Kola nodded, watching her closely. Then prove yourself, she said. Help me catch a murder.
Kola blinked. What?
Tenny explained everything. The missing people, Pastor Ezekiel's suspicious actions, and her plan. I need you to pretend to be poor and alone. Attend the church, act desperate, and wait for him to target you. Kola frowned. So, you're saying I have to act like someone with no families? Yes. He was silent for a moment. Then he sighed. Tenny, you could have just said you weren't interested instead of sending me to my death. Tenny laughed. Don't be dramatic. Dramatic? This man is a killer. And you want me to walk into his hands. She nodded.
Yes.
But you won't be alone. I'll be watching. Kola shook his head, rubbing his face. Tenny, if I do this, what do I get in return? She smirked. If you help me catch him, I will finally give you a real date. Kola's eyes widened. A real one? No tricks. No tricks. He sighed again, then smiled.
Fine.
But if I die, my ghost will haunt you. Tenny chuckled. You won't die. Trust me. And with that, the plan was set in motion. The next Sunday, Kola walked into Divine Grace Ministries looking like a man who had lost everything. His clothes were dirty. His hair was rough. He had not shaved in days, and he carried only a small bag. Tenny had helped him prepare his story. His name was Cunnel, a fake name. He was an orphan. His parents had died in a car accident, and he had nowhere to go. He was living on the streets, begging for food. He had come to church looking for help. Kola sat at the back of the church, pretending to be lost in thought. He made sure to look sad and lonely. The service began. The choir sang, people clapped, and Pastor Ezekiel took the stage, smiling. Then came the moment they were waiting for. If you are here and you have no family, please stand. Kola slowly stood up, along with a few others. Pastor Ezekiel's eyes scanned the room, and when they landed on Kola, they lingered for a moment. Then he smiled. My son, don't worry. The church will take care of you. The congregation clapped. Kola bowed his head, pretending to be grateful. After the service, one of the pastor's assistants approached him. Pastor Ezekiel wants to see you. Kola nodded, hiding his excitement. The trap was working. That Wednesday, just as planned, Kola arrived at the pastor's house. It was a large building, bigger than most in town, with high walls and a black gate. Two tall men stood outside, watching him as he entered. Inside, the house was grand, too grand for a man who had been poor just 2 years ago. Pastor Ezekiel welcomed him warmly. Cunnel, my son, I am glad you came. Kola bowed. Thank you, sir. The pastor smiled. Come, let's talk. He led Kola to a small room behind the church. It was quiet, with just a table, 2 chairs, and a small bed in the corner. A plate of food and a glass of water were waiting on the table. "Eat, my son," the pastor said. "You must be hungry." Kola's heart pounded. He knew better than to touch that food. He shook his head. "I'm not hungry, sir." The pastor's smile faltered. "You haven't eaten all day."
Eat.
"I'm fine." The pastor's expression darkened. "I insist." Kola shook his head again. "I'm sorry, sir, but I don't eat late at night." For a moment there was silence. Then Pastor Ezekiel sighed. "You are a stubborn one." He clapped his hands twice. The door opened, and 2 large men entered. Kola's blood ran cold. "Tie him up," the pastor ordered. The men grabbed him, forcing him to the ground. Kola struggled, but they were too strong. He felt the cold touch of a rope tightening around his wrists. "Tonight," Pastor Ezekiel said, "you will serve a greater purpose." Kola's heart pounded in fear. Was this it? Had he made a mistake? But then, something happened. A loud bang echoed through the room. The door burst open, and standing there, gun in hand, was Tenny. "Let him go." Her voice was sharp, her eyes blazing with anger. Behind her, 5 police officers rushed in, pointing their weapons at the pastor and his men. Pastor Ezekiel stumbled backward. "What is the meaning of this?" Tenny stepped forward. "It means your time is up." The officers quickly untied Kola, who jumped his feet, breathing heavily. The pastor tried to run, but 2 officers grabbed him. "Let me go," he screamed. "I am a man of God."
Tenny scoffed.
"A man of God who kills his own members?" The pastor's face paled. "I don't know what you're talking about." Tenny smiled coldly. "We recorded everything." She reached into Kola's pocket and pulled out a small microphone, one he had been wearing the entire time. The pastor's eyes widened in horror. "We have your confession. It's over." The officers dragged him outside, where an angry crowd was already gathering. People shouted, throwing insults at him. Some even threw stones. As the pastor was pushed into a police van, Tenny turned to Kola. "Are you okay?"
Kola grinned.
"I thought I was going to die." She laughed. "You did well." He smirked. "So, does this mean I get my date?" Tenny rolled her eyes. "Let's catch our breath first." But she was smiling. The night air was cool, but Tenny felt warm relief washing over her as she watched the police van drive away, taking Pastor Ezekiel with it. The crowd outside the church was still murmuring in shock, some people whispering prayers, others cursing the so-called man of God. Kola, still catching his breath, turned to Tenny with a grin. "So, about that date?" Tenny smirked, shaking her head. "You almost got yourself killed, and that's the first thing you're thinking about?" Kola chuckled. "I have my priorities." Tenny rolled her eyes, but couldn't hide the amusement on her face. "Let's get through this night first." The police officers were already taking statements from some of the church members. Some were in shock, unable to believe their pastor was a killer. Others, like the elderly woman from the front row during service, were crying.
Tenny sighed.
She knew how difficult it would be for them to accept the truth.
But the truth was out now.
And there was no going back. An officer walked up to Tenny. "Ma'am, we need you to come with us. We found something inside the church." Tenny exchanged a look with Kola before following the officer into the church building. They were led to the pastor's private office. The room was grand, decorated with golden furniture, expensive rugs, and religious symbols. But what caught Tenny's attention was a wooden door at the back of the room. "We found this hidden behind a large bookshelf," the officer explained. One officer pushed the door open, revealing a dark staircase leading underground. Tenny's stomach twisted. "An underground room? We suspect this is where he kept his victims before. Well, you know." Tenny took a deep breath and descended the stairs, Kola right behind her. The air was damp and heavy. The smell of dust and something rotten filled their noses. Then they saw it. A small, dark room with a single bed, a bucket in the corner, and a pile of tattered clothes. Kola swallowed hard. "This is sick." Tenny clenched her fists. "This is where he kept them." She moved towards the pile of clothes and noticed something, a small blue shirt with a familiar logo on it. Her eyes widened. This is a school uniform. The officer nodded grimly. We suspect at least one of his victims was a child. Tenny's heart pounded. This was worse than she thought. Pastor Ezekiel wasn't just killing people. He was taking children too. The police continued their investigation over the next few days, uncovering more shocking details. A mass grave was found behind the church, hidden beneath the garden where Pastor Ezekiel often claimed to pray for lost souls. DNA tests later confirmed that some of the missing people reported in the past 2 years were buried there. The police also discovered that Pastor Ezekiel had been working with 2 other men who had been helping him find vulnerable victims. One of them was his driver, a man named Benga, who had gone missing after the arrest. The other? A high-ranking member of the church. Someone the congregation trusted. Tenny was determined to find out who it was. A week later, Tenny sat in her office, looking over documents related to the case. She was exhausted. The past few days had been filled with police reports, interviews, and breaking news updates. And yet, one question haunted her. Who was the second accomplice? A knock on the door made her look up. It was Deacon Adielu, one of the senior church members. Tenny narrowed her eyes. How can I help you, sir? The man hesitated before stepping inside. He was in his mid-50s, dressed in an expensive suit, and always carried himself with importance. I came to talk, he said. About the case. Tenny folded her arms. Go on. Deacon Adielu sighed. I know who the second accomplice is. Tenny's heartbeat quickened. Who? The man hesitated again, then finally spoke. It's me. The room went silent. Tenny stared at him, her mind struggling to process what she had just heard. Excuse me? Deacon Adielu lowered his head. I didn't want to be involved. But Pastor Ezekiel, he forced me. He knew things about me, secrets from my past. He said if I didn't help him, he would ruin me. Tenny clenched her fists. So you helped him kill people? The deacon shook his head quickly. No. I never touched anyone. My job was just to find the right people, the weak ones, the ones who had no family. I thought he was just helping them. Tenny's voice was cold. And when you realized the truth? Deacon Adielu swallowed hard. By then, it was too late. I was already in too deep. Tenny stared at him, disgusted. Do you know where Benga is? The deacon hesitated, then nodded. He's trying to escape the country. He has contacts in Cotonou. Tenny stood. You're coming with me to the police. Now? The deacon didn't argue. He knew there was no way out. Thanks to Deacon Adilu's confession, the police tracked Benga to the border and arrested him before he could escape. With both accomplices in custody, the case against Pastor Ezekiel was sealed. A month later, the trial began. The courtroom was packed with people, families of victims, church members, reporters. Pastor Ezekiel pleaded not guilty, claiming he was being framed. But with all the evidence, including Cola's undercover recording, he didn't stand a chance. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without parole. The church was shut down permanently. And finally, after 2 years of horror, justice was served. Tenny stood outside the courthouse, taking a deep breath. It was over. She felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to see Cola smiling at her. You did it, she smiled back. We did it. Cola stretched. So, do I get my date now? Tenny laughed. Fine, Cola. You earned it. His face lit up. Yes. Best case ever. As they walked away, Tenny felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. She had uncovered the truth. She had given families closure. And, most importantly, she had stopped a monster. That brings us to the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching.